Hi, I'm Susan Swain, host of C-SPAN's Q&A, where we spend an hour with nonfiction writers and historians who add context to today's news. There's a new space race underway, and it involves hundreds of private companies around the globe that are building small rockets and small satellites destined for near-Earth orbit. It's estimated that as many as 100,000 small satellites will soon be launched. This will ultimately transform communications and raise complex privacy and security issues. For 5 years, Bloomberg Businessweek writer Ashlee Vance has been following 4 companies competing in this modern-day space race, and he recounts their technological, financial, and personal challenges in his new book, When the Heavens Went on Sale: The Misfits and Geniuses Racing to Put Space Within Reach. He's our guest this week. Our conversation will begin in just a moment.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
We're in stage 1.
Liftoff indication. We have liftoff. SpaceX Falcon 1 launch vehicle. Falcon has cleared the tower. Plus 12.
Ashlee Vance, that is the 2008 launch of SpaceX's Falcon 1, a launch which you write in your new book quite likely changed the course of history. How so?
Well, it was this momentous occasion for the rise of commercial space. We'd had several rich people try over the years to try and get commercial space going, to wrest space from the total control of a handful of governments, and nobody had really succeeded. And in this moment, even though this SpaceX rocket was small and it was not at all obvious of where all this was heading, it was a success. And as I argue in the book, it finally opened people's minds to what was possible. Maybe they could also do something like this. And mostly it unlocked these decades of kind of latent enthusiasm to try and do something new in space.
Your book is titled When the Heavens Went on Sale: The Misfits and Geniuses Racing to Put Space Within Reach. What is the line of demarcation between old space and what you describe as new space? What's the difference between the two?
Yeah, if you look at the SpaceX rocket, it's a pretty good example. It's this idea of having a clean slate to try new things. I argue that we had this explosion of activity and success in the 1960s and 70s, but things had gotten quite stuck. NASA, military contractors really just built rockets the same way. They largely built satellites the same way. New space came in as this clean slate and had the advantage of huge advances in materials and electronics. And so a lot of it comes down to cost. This was with this clean slate, people like SpaceX and other companies started building things cheaper, faster. The satellites came with much, much more capability than they had in the past. And really, it's just this broad modernization of the industry and clearly a push toward the commercial aspect where you actually have to do things fast and cheap.
Did old space react well to the entry of these new businesses?
No, it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the whole, no. I write quite a bit in the book about a NASA center in Silicon Valley called NASA Ames that was trying to do things differently, and NASA had a pretty allergic reaction anytime they caught wind that people in the center were trying to do things more cheaply. A lot of people within NASA doubted SpaceX and certainly did not want them heading towards taking humans to space. They didn't really think a commercial company could be trusted with lives. That said, there were factions within NASA and the US government that should get a lot of credit because they were the sort of the rebels, and they funded a lot of these commercial space activities, gave these companies key contracts at a difficult time. But you can imagine that the traditional players were not happy to see new companies coming.
So to be clear for our listeners, this is not a book about Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Richard Branson. Whose story do you tell?
This is really the underbelly of commercial space. I avoided the billionaires on purpose. I mean, frankly, outside of Elon and SpaceX, what Jeff Bezos has done and Branson has done with Virgin have not been that successful. And it was clear to me that the real action is not space tourism, which is what both of those men's ventures do, or building colonies on Mars quite yet. It's this race to put up thousands and actually tens of thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit. And there are small rocket startups all over the world. There's hundreds of satellite companies all over the world. And I got really interested in the eccentric characters that were inhabiting this world and just the fact that new space had sprung up all over the place. And so I spent 5 years really just hanging out with this oddball set of characters that is I think just do not resemble old space people in any way.
But you don't consider yourself a space journalist.
No, I write. My day job is at Bloomberg Businessweek. I'm a feature writer. I hop about from subject to subject in the technology realm. I do tend to get excited by hard engineering projects and machines in particular. This book came out. I'd just written a biography on Elon Musk previously, and my absolute favorite part of the reporting was SpaceX and really the early days of SpaceX. It was filled with so much enthusiasm. These 20 somethings who were doing something that had never been done before. They're very clever and energetic. And right as I finished that book, I could see that there were more startups built in this model appearing. And it was a bit of an accident. I got sucked in. I tried to resist writing this book for a while, but in the end, I couldn't fight against it.
What's pretty amazing is that you went over the course of the 5 years to some pretty far corners of the earth. What are some of the places that you visited?
Yeah, I've been to New Zealand several times. I went to India to watch a rocket launch. I went to French Guiana twice to watch a rocket launch. Same in Alaska. I went to Svalbard, which is just about the northernmost landmass you could get to, which happens to be where a lot of satellites in space feed data down to the North Pole. Texas, California, England, you name it.
Well, the scene that you describe in many of these chapters, and I should tell folks you've divided into four profiles of companies, but there's some pretty Wild West stuff going on in some of these operations. What is, for you, an outstanding story among all these that may be the wildest thing you experienced in putting this book together?
Well, I didn't mention Ukraine on that list, that I should have, because that's probably my most memorable experience. There's a company in the book that I write about a lot called Firefly. They're a rocket company based in Texas, but the story is really about the millionaire who founded them, this gentleman named Max Polyakov. He was OBGYN by training. He became a software multimillionaire in Ukraine. At one point, Firefly went bankrupt, and Max swooped in and bought them in Texas and put $250 million into this company. And he ended up with this wild vision. He wanted to unite, his parents had worked on the Soviet space program, and he wanted to unite Ukraine's Soviet aerospace expertise with America's new space expertise, and tried to do this. And as part of my reporting, I got to go to Ukraine with him to see his operations. And I think I am only the second foreign journalist that's ever been to the largest Soviet ICBM factory, which is in Dnipro in Ukraine. And I think I'm the only journalist that's been to the secret rocket testing facilities they have in a forest there. And so it was a bit of an adventure, especially as a child who grew up. I grew up in the 80s during the Cold War, and here I was in these factories that were all meant to assure my destruction if need be. And it was also a bit of a time warp. These facilities really felt like they've been frozen in 1965. They were massive and impressive, but were a ghost of their former selves.
So the goal of all of these companies, SpaceX now excluded, is low Earth orbit. And satellites of all different sizes. What is the ultimate goal of all of this engineering and entrepreneurship?
Yeah. I mean, different people have different goals. The one that I focus on here, and I think is the heart of commercial space, is building what I describe as a computing shell around the Earth, and so I'm quite sure most people are not aware that until about 2020 we had 2,500 satellites orbiting around us in low Earth orbit. From 2020 to now, that number has already gone up to 8,000. And over the next decade, it's very likely going to go to 100,000 satellites, if not more. And I view this as our next technological infrastructure build out. It reminds me a lot of the early days of the dot-com boom that I covered, laying fiber optic cables, building data centers. We're building more or less this communications data network in the sky. I'm sure we can get into more of what it's going to do, but that's the big picture, is that we're filling low Earth orbit with immense amounts of computing capability.
So on the surface, when you describe it, it sounds like every corner of the Earth will have access to the internet, a plus, especially in developing countries. The minus would be every corner of the Earth is probably going to be surveilled.
Right, yeah, and these are the two big buckets that these initial satellites are going into. One is communications and one is imaging. And yes, so we are right now, probably people watching this are familiar with Starlink, which is SpaceX's space internet system. It beams high-speed internet down from above. As you mentioned, half the world's population cannot be reached by fiber optic cables today. And so here you have this chance for all these people to participate in the modern economy. The downside of the space internet is that you will never be away from your internet connection again. If you ever found peace on a mountaintop or in a desert, those days are soon to be over. And the other big bucket is imaging. So images from space used to be quite rare and expensive. Governments controlled them, and just a handful of governments at that. The satellites could only look at certain locations of interest, but these new companies, particularly Planet Labs that I write about, have put up hundreds upon hundreds of imaging satellites around the Earth, and they can see every spot on Earth every day.
Well, what's going to happen to our night skies when all of these small satellites are launched?
We're already seeing it. I don't know, if you ever go on a camping trip these days, you can see these satellites going by one in these little trains. And I don't, again, this is why I wrote the book now. I don't think most people are aware how much things have already changed. There's a sadness to it for me because I think our night sky is going to change forever. There's also an optimism. I mean, this book is fundamentally optimistic. I think what we're doing up there is net positive. I also think it's somewhat inevitable. I was shocked a bit when SpaceX first started sending their Starlink satellites up. It took until the first launch for astronomers to start complaining in the press that these satellites were going to harm their research. And we had seen for years what SpaceX intended to do. They're very public with these launches and what was going on. And I've been sort of surprised that there's a lack of public outcry or discussion about this. But to me, it's inevitable at this point, and things are going to change.
If there was public outcry or discussion, would it make any difference?
Probably not, especially at this moment. I mean, it's the newest economic territory that we've had in many, many, many years. About $260 billion of venture capital have been pumped into this over the last 3 years. As I mentioned, there's a lot of good that comes with this, and there's a lot of desire on the parts of militaries and governments alongside the commercial sector to make this happen. I think I can see nothing at this moment that would slow this down. It's only growing faster.
And what about the technological challenges? Are all of these thousands of satellites being coordinated somehow? What if they crash into one another? What happens to space junk or debris falling to Earth?
Yeah, I have good news and bad news. Yes, traditionally the U.S. through the military and other agencies has tracked objects in space. Other countries do similar things. They have not done a tremendously good job at keeping up with the rate at which these new satellites are going up. But there are, of course, startups now that are getting into this monitoring business. One of them is called Leo Labs. It's about a 50-person outfit in Silicon Valley. They can track pretty much everything in space, objects down to 2 centimeters in size. Not only do they track the stuff, they help coordinate these satellites from hitting into each other. So the satellites quite literally send each other messages of their position, even to competing satellites, and they have thrusters on them. And there's this dance that's taking place now where these things are always moving and shifting out of the way. The huge question that is probably obvious is that we've got this orchestration process with a few thousand satellites, but how well does it play when we have 100,000? I think the companies are incented clearly to not have anything crash into each other because it would be disastrous potentially. But we also have this problem that there are new spacefaring nations as a result of this rise of commercial space, and even if people are well intentioned, they are not very experienced. And so the truth is we don't know what is going to happen.
As I mentioned earlier, the book is divided into 4 major profiles. But before we get to them, you do write a couple of chapters on someone who is really part, I guess, of old space in some ways. His Air Force Brigadier General, now retired, Pete Worden. Who is he, and why were you so interested in him?
Probably my favorite character in the book. Just so Pete is an astrophysicist by education. He's a PhD. He ended up in the Air Force. He rose through the ranks to become a brigadier general. During his career, he was a very high up player with the Star Wars Missile Defense Shield (SDI). He ran a number of Black Ops operations that he can't talk about to this day. But he was always this figure lurking in the background he was an iconoclast. He was a real kind of disturbing force within the government, pushing people to do things cheaper, faster, better, and was not always well received. But one of his main areas of focus going back to the 80s and 90s was cheap satellites, cheap rockets. Let's not do things the way we've always done them. Let's try something new. And he didn't receive a lot of enthusiasm for his ideas until in the early 2000s he takes over NASA Ames, the Silicon Valley NASA center, and is the director there. And he brings in a bunch of like-minded 20-somethings to rethink how we do stuff in space. And I argue in the book that this NASA center, pretty much as much as SpaceX, helped push this whole commercial space idea along and bring a lot of these ideas to the fore.
What you call the generation that he inspired, Pete's kids, and at least are 3 of the people you profile part of his coterie?
Yes, yeah. There's Planet Labs, the company we mentioned, the satellite company. They grew out of NASA Ames. There's a rocket company called Astra, which is trying to make the world's cheapest, most mass-produced rocket. They also came out of Pete's kids, this group of 20-somethings. There's quite a number of startups, but those are the 2 that I profile in the book.
Well, what was his magic? What is it that he accomplished at NASA Ames that was so successful in inspiring this generation? And where did he get the money?
Wow. So Pete's this rare, a lot of these kids that he was bringing in, I write about them in the book as space hippies. I mean, they were idealists. He was in some ways like Lord Vader for them because he had done Star Wars and they were very much against the militarization of space. But to Pete's credit, he's very open-minded, and he was not looking for people just to agree with him. He was looking for people that wanted to try new things. And so he brought these youngsters in. He had money in the sense that he was running a NASA center that had a decent budget. However, he had to hide a lot of what these kids were working on because, at one point I write about they were trying to make a very low cost lunar lander, something maybe that would be $20 million as opposed to 500 million. And they had to hide this in a more or less like a large storage closet because every time NASA heard about it, or a couple senators who controlled NASA's budget or were affiliated with lobbyists from Boeing or Lockheed heard about this, they shut this program down, and he would have to hide it again and restart it. And NASA and these contractors simply did not want to know if a low-cost lunar lander was possible. And Pete, at the risk, he was almost fired about 18 times, but found ways to navigate through the system to give these kids a chance.
Well, you're talking on the network that televises the Congress. So, which are some examples of senators he went toe to toe with in trying to run these programs?
Well, Richard Shelby in particular, and Chuck Grassley at different times, but Richard Shelby has always, in my opinion, had a thing against new space. He's much more aligned with the traditional aerospace players. He fought quite hard to put blockades in front of SpaceX before all of this happened, and he would prefer, in again, I argue that he would prefer to see Lockheed and Boeing and companies like that doing their thing, and quite literally, made life a living hell for Pete when he was trying to do these projects.
So, Pete Worden retired from NASA Ames in 2015. Has Ames continued its entrepreneurial aspect with space after he left?
No, it's quite sad to me. NASA centers tend to receive press when they do these huge missions, maybe something sending a rover to Mars. And again, look, NASA does amazing things. And I think that is the kind of stuff they should be doing. You don't hear a lot of day-to-day news about these NASA centers. It's only these moments. NASA Ames was the outlier. Pete had turned this into a fascinating place beyond the things we talked about. They had deals with Google to lease real estate, to build things like Google Moon and Google Mars, and it was a very entrepreneurial center. Since he left, no, they've actually put policies in place to make sure something like Pete Worden never happens again. They've changed the reporting structure so that the underlings at NASA Ames have to report to headquarters as opposed to just the NASA director, and the place is slowed down. And to me, I live right by it. It's just a less interesting place.
So maybe this is speculation that I'm asking you to do on your part, but why would they not want to encourage a new generation of space exploration? Why do they want to make it harder?
I get into this in the book. Part of it is politics. NASA, you could question whether it's a good thing that your very forward-looking space exploration agency is kind of run by Congress and has its budgets set in that environment. I don't think it's probably the most healthy thing. You also had these decades of tradition that had built up after the 60s. We had rockets that worked. We had satellites that worked. The worst thing you could be was the person that tried to change things and then had a rocket blow up because of something you changed, or had a $1 billion satellite not work when it got to space because of some consumer electronics thing that you happened to have put on this satellite. So you had this environment where the only thing you could do was be punished from changing something and making a mistake. And so people didn't try new things. And then you have all the money on top of that. If NASA can make a $20 million lunar lander, that immediately puts a lot of $500 million lunar lander projects at risk. It has people rethinking them. And so I think there was just too much money on the line for something like this to really take place at NASA without someone like Pete, who was quite frankly willing to lose his job.
Well, let's go from the general to the particular and start with Planet Labs. And again, this is part of Pete's kids' generation. Who are the co-founders of Planet Labs, and what was their goal?
Yeah, there were three. There's Will Marshall, who's a Brit, Robbie Shingler, who's an American, and Chris Boshausen, who's an Australian. All three of them, as you mentioned, they worked at Ames. They totally fit this mold of these kind of space hippies, these idealists. What they realized was that smartphones, we're going back to maybe like 2009, 2010. Um, that things like smartphones had got very good, and not only that, they were full of all these sensors and cameras and really had much of the innards of what you might want an imaging satellite to do. And so they quite literally sent smartphones into space to see if they could survive the rigors of a launch and the conditions in space. And it turned out they could. And once they had this proof point, they realized, I think there's a company here in making much cheaper satellites. And so a traditional imaging satellite might be the size of a school bus. It might cost $1 billion and take years and years to develop. And they built instead shoebox sized satellites that cost on the order of $100,000 each. And instead of sending up just a handful of them, they've sent up hundreds. And today they already have over 200 of these satellites orbiting around the Earth, taking photos, many photos of every spot on Earth every single day.
So Planet Labs calls their small satellite doves. What do they do?
Well, and they're called doves, again, going back to this idealistic notions. They started off not trying to make a company, but a nonprofit, really. They wanted these satellites to go around the Earth and really become this accounting system for human activity. So literally count every single tree on the planet, watch methane coming out of fields in Texas and Oklahoma and put some metrics around it, track the movement of refugees, sort of be this open source of information that was not under the control of the handful of governments that dominated imaging satellites. As time went on, this was a expensive venture. It was exciting. Venture capitalists came in. They had to turn this into a business. So they still do all the things I mentioned today, but their satellites are also used by farmers to look at the amount of chlorophyll in their crops from space to find the best time to harvest their crops or the health of their crops. Investors use these satellites to look at the number of cars in a Walmart parking lot during back to school shopping season all over the country to try to figure out if Walmart is having a booming quarter. They look at things like the amount of oil that's sitting in storage containers in Saudi Arabia to check the oil supply. So, it's not looking at people's faces. It's not reading license plates on somebody's car, but it is checking on this economic activity of humans and this environmental impact of humans.
Well, going back to some theme in our earlier conversation, you write, Planet is aware of the mix of powers and perils their technology can unleash. How so?
Well, they do come from this background of, and I think it's authentic, of trying to do the right thing. They've so completely changed the game of this accessibility of this information. If you were not one of the richest nations on Earth, you did not have satellites, imaging satellites. And so now almost any nation, part of what Planet does is keep things like this around from places like North Korea, but almost every other nation can log onto their service, pull up these images, and now they too have this power to see what's happening from space. Individuals like the two of us now also have this power. You can just go on Planet's website and look at these pictures as well. But to me, it's this open source information. It's that governments no longer control everything, and there is power and responsibility that comes with that. The founders have tried to put rules in place around how they treat their images to mitigate some of the risk, but it's just a completely new regime. And I could give you a couple examples if you have time.
Yeah, I want to. Let me actually put the voice of Robbie Shingler into the conversation, talking about his vision for the company, and then we'll come back with your examples. Here he is in October of 2016.
My co-founders, I have two other co-founders, Will and Chris, and we met together at the United Nations actually 15 years ago. Now, over the last 3 years since we've been into space, we've launched 145 satellites, and today we operate the world's largest constellation of imaging satellites. Our first mission at Planet is to image the whole world every day, and to make global change visible, accessible, and actionable, which means we have to have over 100 spacecraft that are autonomously working perfectly in space to act in concert together as a disaggregated sensor network in space to create a line scanner for the planet, to do a global monitoring mission. And then it's really about what you do with that information.
So since 2016, those numbers have just increased from Planet. There he is talking about their aspiration. So what have been some of the high-profile challenges they faced?
Yeah, I mean, there's some obvious positive examples to me. If you look at the Amazonian rainforest, these satellites have AI systems on them now that immediately can see when somebody is illegally cutting down trees. This used to be a process that, was like a human on the ground investigation process to try and figure this out, alert the authorities. Now these satellites kick off immediate alerts to authorities in Brazil and Peru to go check out what's happening. Ukraine is a very obvious example. In the lead up to the war, we had Russia denying that they were going to invade Ukraine. You had the US saying the Russians were. It was Planet's images and a company called Maxar that does something similar. Their images that we saw with troops amassed on the Ukrainian border that made it quite clear what was about to happen. And so, again, you did not have a government telling us what was going to happen. You could see it with your own eyes. There's more controversial things that have happened, in the lead up to India's most recent presidential election. India bombed a site in Kashmir, as some would argue, kind of a show of power for Modi ahead of the election. In Pakistan, they denied that this missile hit its target, and this huge debate erupted, and it turned out Planet had images that showed quite clearly India had missed. India's government called Planet, asked them to hold the images, not to put this out in the press. And Planet published them anyway, even though it launches on Indian rockets sometimes and does a lot of business in the country.
We are a little more than halfway through an hour with Ashlee Vance. His new book is When the Heavens Went on Sale, The Misfits and Geniuses Racing to Put Space Within Reach.
Can I give you one more example, just because
Sure,
it's the best one, and I think it'll blow people away? There's a undergraduate student who a couple of years ago he was at Reed, and he was playing around with Planet's software on his laptop, and he discovered, this was national press, people will have seen this in the New York Times and the Washington Post front page. This undergraduate student on his laptop found 40 nuclear silos in the desert in China that the public had no idea about. It's unclear if the military even knew this existed. Usually military satellites are not pointed at a desert where there's nothing, and Planet's satellites are. They're pointed at everything. And it was just such like a powerful moment that this kid doing this as a hobby could accomplish what nation states had done before. I just think it's a fascinating example.
And you can only imagine that there are maybe thousands of people on their computers around the globe exactly looking for stories like that to tell.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to Peter Beck. Peter Beck is probably one of the richest men on the earth that people have never heard of before. What's his story?
Amazing life story. So Peter Beck hails from Invercargill in New Zealand. It's the very bottom of the South Island, as close to Antarctica as you can get. It's a small rural farming community. Peter never went to university. He's about the same age as me, about 45. He never went to university. He was this tinkerer from his earliest days, always in his parents' garage, working on cars and bikes and engines. And he ends up getting a job at a Fisher and Paykel, the country's, home appliance maker. He was working on dishwashers, and that was his day job for many years, making very nice dishwashers. But at night, he would go home to his house, and he had a shed. and he was consumed by this idea of rockets. He made his own propellant. He used to put plastic bags over his body to protect himself from his homemade propellant. He made rocket engines, and miraculously, he was successful at it. He built a small rocket a number of years ago, more or less by himself, and then based off of this, he was able to get some funding and to start a company called Rocket Lab, and it was based in New Zealand for a number of years. It's funny that people have not heard of it because after SpaceX, it is by far the most successful commercial rocket company. And really, SpaceX and Rocket Lab are the only two in the world that are launching on a regular cadence. And so, this guy is the second coming of Elon Musk, just without all the drama.
And is it publicly traded or privately owned today?
It was privately owned during the pandemic. A number of these companies went public when money was quite cheap and investors were quite enthusiastic. For the first time ever, we had this raft of aerospace companies go public, and so it's public now. I think at last check, it was worth about $3.5 billion, if I remember right.
I'm going to get ahead of myself by asking this question, but it was fascinating to me that during the pandemic, when money was going around, you write that the space industry was essential business and allowed to continue to operate by the government.
It was, and there's more to that. I mean, I've been working on this book for 5 years. The pandemic hits. These space ventures are very risky. When the pandemic first started, I completely assumed that most of the companies I was covering were going to go bankrupt because I thought the economy would tighten and this was going to be kind of disastrous for this new area of industry. And the exact opposite thing happened. Eventually, money from investors, because of the low interest rates, became readily available, and we had never really seen a new commercial aerospace company go public before. But in the span of just a couple months, I want to say it was in late 2021, we had about a dozen go public, including Planet Labs and Rocket Lab, and these companies were flooded with hundreds of millions of dollars. And so this was all shocking to me. So, and now we're at the point where, again, these companies are starting to run out of money, and we'll see who makes it through all this.
So Peter Beck's idea, if putting it in my own words, is almost like the FedEx of space. He wanted to keep putting rockets that would take other people's payloads. Is that right? Yeah,
sorry, I should have put a fine point on this for people. There's sort of three classes of rockets, roughly. There's giant rockets that cost, SpaceX charges $60 million per launch. Most charge about $200 million. There's kind of medium size, and these large rockets can take both. Well, SpaceX can take both humans and many thousands of tons of cargo. There's medium-sized rockets that are totally designed just for satellites. They can usually carry a couple of the large satellites. And then Rocket Lab is in this new breed makes this new breed of rocket, which is a small rocket, costs just a few $1 million, and it's meant to fly instead of once a month like the big ones. It's meant to fly every couple of days, and really to be this delivery service for all these satellites that are going into low Earth orbit. And so it's this new, it really is like this new type of FedEx service that's never been available before.
And where the stories come together, didn't they take up some of the doves from Planet?
They did, yeah. So something like the doves, which are shoebox sized, are kind of perfect for these new small cheap rockets, and Planet and Rocket Lab have this relationship. These new satellites, it's such a different regime than what came before. You used to put a satellite in orbit and just not touch it for 20 years, and these new ones, for better or worse, are almost disposable. They're only meant to be in orbit for 3 to 5 years. They're very purposely supposed to deorbit. After that, burn up upon reentry, and part of the reason they're disposable is then you put up new technology. In 3 to 5 years, semiconductors, memory, storage, all of that stuff improves dramatically. And so instead of being on 20-year-old technology, you have fresh technology all the time, and you obviously need a lot of rockets to do this service.
So New Zealand was virgin territory for the aerospace or rocket industry. What were the pluses and minuses of him trying to start a company like this in New Zealand?
Well, it's unbelievable. I mean, this is a country that hardly has a military. I sat with the Prime Minister, John Key, who was present during when Peter Beck was starting the company. It was one of the most hilarious discussions I've ever had. He just showed up in shorts and a t-shirt, and we were having brunch, and he's like, "Look, this guy Peter Beck walked into my office, said he's going to build a rocket. He was going to go to the moon one day." I thought, that seems quite ambitious for our country. We only have a couple tanks, and they barely work. And do we want to get into this? But I think there's no aerospace history or talent to lean on. But I think the plus was the fact that Peter Beck could even have this conversation with the Prime Minister anyway after just a couple of phone calls, and the government got behind it. You can get things done quite quickly in New Zealand because it's a small country. And I don't know if the government would love me saying this, but Rocket Lab basically got to write the country's space policy. I'm sure these officials looked over it, but they essentially took NASA and FAA and FCC guidelines around space, these huge binders full of regulations, and they ripped out a ton of the pages that they didn't think were necessary. And this became the framework for New Zealand space regulation. And so Rocket Lab was able to move quite quickly. What they accomplished, it should be celebrated, I think, because it's so rare. I have followed all these other rocket companies in the United States with SpaceX veterans, Lockheed veterans, and they have all struggled mightily to fly a rocket for the first time. And Rocket Lab did this with none of that talent to rely on. And it's an incredible story.
We have a video clip of Peter Beck. This is from 2022. And in it, he's talking about the company's collaboration with NASA.
If I think back through Rocket Lab's history, it's peppered with all of these partnerships, whether it be, NRO missions we've done and partnered with. The NASA VCLS contract, one of the very first launches that we actually did, was a great example of a NASA Rocket Lab partnership where we were just a little tiny company at that point. We had no proven technology at all. And NASA partnered with us and gave us a contract to launch something, which, when I look back on, was quite formative for the company because it enabled us to take that NASA stamp and go and raise venture capital.
Ashlee Vance, direct people to your chapters on Peter Beck, which are full of some of the huge challenges he had with the federal government and getting his company off the ground, as it were. But what do you have to say about his description of these partnerships that really help them grow?
Again, this is all very true. As much as I argue that this is now a commercial, largely a commercial endeavor, and I do think that's true. Again, the government, particularly the Department of Defense, has long desired something they describe as responsive space, and this is exactly the idea of a cheap rocket that can fly on a moment's notice and take a satellite up and put it exactly where you want it. If a conflict breaks out in some country, you immediately want to put surveillance satellites right over it all the time, watching everything. And this is kind of the precursor of Space Force. The DoD, particularly through DARPA, had been trying to fund efforts like this. DARPA funded SpaceX's first rocket and had struggled, so now as companies like Rocket Lab have come along, the DoD and the Department of Defense and DARPA have gotten behind these companies. And then for NASA and other agencies, you have to remember also, this represents a whole new world for being able to do science. You used to have to pay the upfront cost at minimum to send a scientific mission to space was tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. If you have something interesting, you can get on a Rocket Lab rocket for a few $1,000,000 now and go do your science.
On to Astra, and you described them as the opposite of Rocket Lab. This was a memorable quote that you said, if Rocket Lab had a perfectly engineered vehicle, Astra had a Franken machine. What was their business model like?
It's in some sense along the same path of a small rocket. It's just the very, very extreme end of it. Peter Beck is this consummate engineer. Everything has to be perfect, and so the rocket lab is made called Electron is this magnificent machine. It is, even though it's a small, cheap rocket, is expensive by small rocket standards because it's so well engineered. Astra had the other idea. They said, look, we're not going to use fancy materials like carbon fiber that Rocket Lab uses. We're just going to use sheet metal. We're going to make this thing as cheap as possible, and we are going to take the hand crafting out of rocket building. So we are going to make a factory that can mass produce a rocket every day, and we're going to launch a rocket every day, and we're going to charge just a couple $1,000,000 to do that. Even though this industry has come a really long way, it is still quite difficult to mass produce these machines. And so this thesis holds. Astra is based in Silicon Valley in Alameda, which is near Oakland, and is a bit more of the Silicon Valley cavalier spirit, I would say, to building rocketry. And so they've been trying to move quite fast, and there's been a number of ups and downs to their approach.
How were they able? They're not just headquartered in Alameda, they're building rockets in Alameda, California. How were they able to convince public officials that this was something that people would want to have in their backyards?
This was one of those build it first and ask for permission later type situations. So I started covering Astra from the very first day they started, even actually before that, as they were discussing it. And their facility is located, I would say it's about 1,500 yards from a suburban neighborhood in Alameda. The company operated in total secrecy for its first 2 or 3 years. I was allowed to see what was happening as long as I didn't disclose it. And I was frankly shocked. I mean, they would test their engines inside of this old Navy jet engine testing facility, but you could hear these tests echoing through the neighborhood as the years went on. They had the rockets standing up in the back of their facility. These rockets are essentially missiles. They're little ICBMs, more or less. And I kept waiting for somebody to phone someone, the police. I don't know who you call when you see a ICBM near your soccer field, but nobody ever called. It took these couple of years until one day a helicopter traffic crew finally spotted this missile sitting in the back of the factory.
And what happened?
They reported it, and there was some uproar. By this point, the city officials in Alameda knew what was going on. I do not actually think that many government officials knew what was going on until quite well into Astra's history, when as this word started to leak out, they had to start inviting people in. But this was very much meant to be kind of a surprise situation for everyone. When that news report came out, it made the press, but there was no immediate uproar. I actually don't think most of the viewers or sort of the typical viewer really understood what was going on.
When people read this chapter, there's so much about the many failures that they had before successes, and they were launching from the wilderness in Alaska. And going back to the Peter Beck story, his folks were working in an outpost in an island off New Zealand. What motivates, it's real hardship life for the people that are working on these projects beyond the founders. How do they keep them motivated and employed in these long periods of times in these remote locations?
I think in a lot of ways, the space industry benefits from the mystique around it and these centuries of mythology that we attach to it. It does not seem like a regular business. It seems in some ways like this kind of higher calling. It's obviously, we always say, that it's not rocket science. It still has that aura of being one of the hardest engineering things humans can do. And so you take a lot of pride that you're working on a rocket. I heard many times from the engineers and technicians, it's just cool to send something to space and be able to tell your family and friends that you did that. So I think you have this extra motivation. As I write about in the book, though, this is changing, and who knows how things play out, because as this becomes a business, it starts to feel more traditional and mercenary. And there are people in my book who talk about, for them it's just a job. They could be doing anything, and they're there because they might cash in on their stock options, and this might do really well. And this is one of the main arguments I wanted to make in the book, is that throughout, if you go back the last 20, 30 years, every movie you've ever seen about space, every book you have read, it's always our best and brightest pilots are doing this. It's the smartest people from MIT and Caltech are inside this NASA facility, and this new world, it has tiny bits and pieces of that, but is otherwise welders from Texas, people who were on car racing teams, a lot of ex-military 20-somethings. It's a totally new breed of character. High school dropouts, college dropouts. New space does not look like old space at all.
We have about 8 minutes left, and earlier you told us a bit of Max Polyakov's story, you said that he invested more of his personal fortune on space than any other person, $200 million, in his rocket startup company called Firefly. But today you write he is bitter, he doesn't own the company anymore, and all his passion for space is gone. Can you briefly tell us what happened on that personal journey he took?
Yeah, and it's more money after Elon and Jeff Bezos. I would say this is like the tragedy in my book. If you have these four sections. Max took over Firefly in Texas. He pumped over $200 million of his own money. He's not Jeff Bezos rich. He's rich, but that was quite a risk for him, and definitely could have put his money elsewhere. It took a few years for Firefly to get its rocket going. Finally, it was sitting on a pad at Vandenberg Space Force Base, where a lot of rockets launch from. It was getting ready to launch, and then the United States government began asking some questions about Max's business dealings. He has a number of quite shady, I would say, internet dating sites that go beyond dating into some less savory areas, and seem to make it very difficult for people to cancel these services. This was one thing the U.S. government brought up. I saw a complaint from CFIUS that was meant to be secret, and most of that complaint, it barely mentioned the dating sites. It focused on the possibility that this Ukrainian could end up as a Russian asset, and transfer Ukrainian space technology and American to Russia. And so they blocked Max from being able to launch his rocket, and then eventually forced him to sell his stake in Firefly almost entirely on these grounds that he could become a Russian asset. And I have to say, I've spent hundreds of hours with Max. He's subsequently funded a lot of efforts in the Ukrainian war against Russia. If he's a Russian asset, he is the most undercover Russian asset you could imagine.
So that's what I wanted to segue into in our last couple of minutes together, and that's the war in Ukraine and how some of this technology came to bear. You described the Ukrainian war as the first true space war. What do you mean by that?
Well, going back to those Planet Lab images first, in this lead up to the war, we could see what was happening, and no matter what the Russian government, whatever spin they put on things, we had images that showed troops on their way into Ukraine. In the early days of the war, a couple major things happened. First, the Russian troops came in, and again, these imaging satellites can take pictures at day and night with clouds, and they could see all of the Russian troop movements, and the Ukrainian military had these pictures. The public had these pictures. It was embarrassing for the Russians to be stuck on these roads and have the whole world see it, beyond just the Ukrainians being able to plan. Then the Russians went after Ukraine's communications infrastructure, and it turned out that SpaceX had flooded the country with their Starlink antennas, and Ukraine's military and government was able to keep communicating through this space internet system. And so what I argue in the book is, this would have been impossible even just 5 years ago. And It marked a huge change. Russia is a traditional, immense space superpower that had commercial space totally turned against it in a way that it clearly did not expect or underestimated. And you had a company like SpaceX that had really risen to the power of a nation state. There was a period of time when Elon wanted to turn Starlink off. He was upset that people were not paying for it, and he was donating the service to the military, and he threatened to turn it off. And the Ukrainian government and military freaked out. The U.S. government freaked out, and Elon turned it back on. But if he had decided not to, there was nothing any government could do to replicate what Starlink does. They have nowhere near the number of satellites that SpaceX does.
Well, that really raises lots of questions about the power that lies in the hands of private companies. Right now, it seems that they're on the side of what people might think of as the good guys in this war against the Russians. But in future scenarios, if they get to choose sides, it might not be the same outcome. So how does the world, the governments, protect themselves against this enormous power?
Again, this is why I wrote this book. I want people to be aware of this new reality. It is, in fact, not very different from a lot of things that have transpired over the last 20 years. Today, Google, Facebook, they all have much more computing power than the United States government has. They can run and build all of these AI models. Our best universities and government labs simply cannot do what these companies can do. I think space is just another example of this. Something like Tesla that's built out a worldwide charging network for its cars. The American government did not choose to do that. I think we're in this era where these tech companies have got so large, they do these worldwide giant infrastructure plays, and I think space is the next step of that, and people need to wrap their heads around this idea that whatever status quo and balance of power used to exist there, where even Russia and the US could get along on something like the space station, that era is over. And it's not just the companies that you should worry about, it's a country like Russia, whose space program is collapsing. Will they be a rational actor as this new regime takes hold?
So have you got the space bug? Are you going to continue reporting on it as this story continues to evolve?
I mean, I'm definitely going to keep watching it. I'm fascinated. After 5 years of this, and even more going back to the SpaceX book, my next book will head elsewhere. But I do love it, and now it's in my blood, I think.
Can you tell us what your next project is?
Not yet, because I'm still deciding. I sort of got three that I'm batting around. I make a television show called Hello World. It's a technology travel show. I just filmed 10 new episodes of that all over the globe, and I've been producing some documentary films, including one for HBO that will be based on the characters in my book.
The book is When the Heavens Went on Sale: The Misfits and Geniuses Racing to Put Space Within Reach. Ashlee Vance is the author, and thanks so much, Ashlee Vance, for spending an hour with C-SPAN.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Q&A, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please take a minute to rate and review us. You can also send us an email about Q&A at podcasts@c-span.org. Send me your questions, your comments, or ideas. Your feedback is welcome.